Jai Ma Kamakhya, Jai Matara, Jai Bhairava. So today I will be speaking on a little off-beat topic. Normally, all my videos are related to sadhana directly, but this is a different kind of topic. So recently, somebody forwarded me a writing from a traditional point of view, criticizing Swami Vivekananda. I normally would have let it go, but I thought that it's good to put forth certain views very clearly. So, in my opinion, and I was asked, what do I think of this? So, let me start by saying that, in my opinion, in the last almost 100, 150 years, there has never been a more impactful Hindu spiritual figure than Swami Vivekananda. Of that, there is zero doubt. He is no more, but his influence, his writings, his thoughts, um, the energy that he carried is very much present in the astral planes, and it keeps inspiring millions of people. I cannot recall any other spiritual figure, and that includes even the traditional acharyas and all that, who has even a fraction of the impact that Vivekananda had over this period of time. So that in itself is a remarkable feat, because you can control these things. For example, as I've mentioned earlier as well, uh, a degree of acceptance among masses, fame, etc. This is a kind of Shakti. You cannot predict it on your own. And if it is not based on very sound divine principles, or if it is not backed by a greater divine power, the so-called fame also ebbs very quickly. It falls as quickly as it goes. So there are people who may be very famous, but after death, or maybe in a few years after they pass away, nobody remembers them. That happens very quickly. So the only true test of Shakti that a spiritual figure carries within himself is how long after they have passed are their thoughts, their actions, their energy still inspiring people. That is the only true test, because nothing else can control that. You cannot control it randomly. No one can fix this thing. It has to be either there, some power has to be there that makes it work, or if the power is not there, it'll just fall and it'll just dissipate. In this scale alone, every single great spiritual figure of the past, uh, including Swami Vivekananda, stand very tall. So there is no doubt about it. A lot of the resistance that Vivekananda faces, I've seen among especially from the very close circle of traditional people, orthodox, very super orthodox and traditional, is because of Vivekananda's extreme beliefs against casteism. And Vivekananda's, he was very categorical in his opposition to casteism, and also in his very relaxed, uh, sometimes I've seen that in his relaxed food habits. Either way, he came at a time when India was in a subjugated condition. People's lives were very miserable. There was no guarantee that India would even get out of the clutches of the foreign powers, let alone become an independent nation that can prosper. In that circumstances, things are far different from what we have today. So far as when I study his specifically his biography, in fact, everybody should study the biographies of great men, spiritual men, because it teaches you many things apart from their thoughts, how they act, what they do, etc. So when he went to that for that speech in Chicago, uh, I think it was 1893, the year when he went there. Uh, on a ship that took, I think, some, I don't know, 6 7 months or something, wearing that kind of a weird dress, weird for them, not for us, for people outside, like dressed in a garb of a monk with hardly any money. In fact, he reached there and realized that the conference, what he was planning to join, had something known as a registration process, which was already over, and he was just roaming around the streets with almost no money, no place to stay, going hungry for days. And then a chain of very miraculous events happened that made him made it possible for him to appear in that conference, in that parliament of religions, and then from that point onwards, we know that, as they say, it became history. So these things are certainly not humanly governed. There is a greater power, a force that has propelled this specific individual to reach that kind of a stage in spite of the greatest of odds, and not just do that in a very victorious speech that still echoes till today. A power he created, something he established so strong that even 100 years after his after he finished his physical existence, there are innumerable people across this land, Hindus, who get inspired by reading him, his thoughts, his biographies, his actions. That is Shakti. That cannot be replicated. Not everybody has it. You may know a lot of scriptures and you may follow 100 rules, but whether that is there in you or not is very different. And the only test of Shakti is time, nothing else. Mahakal is the only judge. Nobody else can judge. In fact, when I watch, when I think of Swami Vivekananda, I find that there is a lot of Bhairava Tattva in him. In fact, Swami Ramakrishna, who was his guru and who was himself perhaps the greatest Kali Upasak that ever lived in the last 300-400 years, would categorically say that Vivekananda was no ordinary soul, but he was one of the Saptarshis who had come down on the human plane. And he had come down with the specific purpose of re-establishing certain tenets of Dharma for the context of Desh Kal Patra. It is very important to remember that Dharma is not something completely fixed in date and time. It is something that evolves within certain range of principles that are given. And these evolution of Dharma creates various sampradayas, creates interpretations. Think of it, the Gita, which is only a 700 verse text, uh, has been interpreted by traditional acharyas like Vedat Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhvacharya in their own way. Just 700 verses, in that about 15 to 20 verses, each one has interpreted in its own way. So the question is, which one is right? It's not about which one is right. Each one sees reality. As I say, Dharma is not entirely static. It sees reality according to the experiences and the Desh Kal Patra in which the individual lives. In that context, what Swami Vivekananda achieved in that period of time, going against that kind of odds. So this, in fact, this journey that I mentioned right now, where it goes via takes a shape across, in a foreign land, at that time deeply racist. He did face a lot of attack from Christians. Some even tried to poison him um, at various times. And then, in spite of that, going there, succeeding in what he wanted to do with absolute clear signs at every point that there's a divine help that is coming to this man. Uh, this this is something no ordinary person can do. It is impossible. This requires a courage and a strength, inner strength, and a character which is so rare that only somebody who is an amsa or a vibhuti of Shiva can do this. And this is exactly what Ramakrishna had also mentioned, that Vivekananda is an amsa of Lord Shiva himself. And in my own humble understanding, when I read and contemplate his life, I find him to be the greatest manifestation of the Bhairava Tattva among Hindus in the last 100, 200 years. Completely fearless, completely raw, speaking the truth as it is, going into, see, when we say the word fearless, many people start to think that it means that you should be scared of ghosts, you should not be scared of darkness and all that. That is one type of fear, but there is a more organic fear that all humans have: fear of situations, fear of strange places, strange people. Imagine this, going into a completely foreign land wearing that type of a dress, which, I mean, today there are so many Hindu monks who have gone abroad and done, established monasteries, even traditional, people and others, etc. But in that era, in that time, in that kind of an environment, a completely different city where people, if you read the newspaper reports that used to be published in foreign countries, the most denigrating of Hindu culture and dharma, because A, they had no understanding of these things, and B, because it was an inherent and strong racism that was anyway far more greater in that time. So in that environment, going there without proper, resources, not knowing what you have to eat the next day, where you will stay, not knowing how he's going to do that, go to that conference itself, because it had a registration. And as I mentioned, when he reached there, he realized that the registration is over. He had no idea that it required anything like that. Struggling against complete uh, uncertainty, and then winning. This is absolutely divine. This no ordinary soul can do. It doesn't matter how much scriptures you have read and how many slokas you know and how many mantras you have chanted, how much yoga you have done, and you know how much fasting. It is either there in your soul and it comes from many past lives of karmas, many past lives of preparation, or it is not there. And because he had succeeded in the mission that nature had given him, that the divine had given him, today, even 100 years later, he is revered so deeply, and his reverence is going to increase with time. I have seen people. I mean, those who study Swami Vivekananda would know that though he became very popular at that time, after he came back, he again faced a lot of criticism from among Hindu society, Hindu leaders, because of his anti-caste opinions. He was very frank about it. He had no uh, patience for casteism at all, and he would speak very clearly. In fact, in my analysis, this is another very important point on the path of Bhairava. As you go deeper, anybody who has strong caste consciousness and all that, either they will get ejected out of that path, you will not survive the path of Bhairava, or Bhairava is going to rip you apart and ensure that that consciousness is completely destroyed. Anybody has trace of casteism in them, Bhairava is not going to tolerate that beyond a point. His path is exactly like that, and that is how he's the guru of the Kola Marga. In those, imagine in the previous centuries when the Kola Marga actually developed, and that is, I'm talking about 1,000 years ago, etc. They are writing down in texts like the Kularnava that whenever a group of people, when society, ordinary society, was extremely strongly molded into caste compartments, it's writing down that whenever people sit inside the chakra, uh, regardless of caste, everybody is of the same varna. That in those times is a tremendously revolutionary statement. Even though they are saying that it is not only in the context of the chakra, but still in that era. And this kind of a mindset, this kind of a teaching can only come from a deity like Bhairava, who is, after all, Shiva, who has come down. And who is Shiva? The Lord of the cremation ground, the Lord of death and transformation, the very place where all the acharams and dharma stand outside. Once you enter the cremation ground, every kind of rules, attributes that you have fixed in your mind, all of them are outside. He Cremation ground is the purest place because it's raw reality as it is. He is the lord of that place. Bhairava is the lord of that place. So it's natural that his path will have these kind of, as you go deeper, you will realize this in your own sadhana itself. So that manifestation, when Swami Vivekananda was, he would be very clear. I find his writings and his speeches to be extremely rational, and that's one of the greatest qualities in him. I find this rationality and this when he found that certain things, and in fact not certain things, many things about the current manifestation of casteism that was present during his times was fundamentally spiritually wrong, and perhaps a corruption from what the system used to be at an earlier time. He would be completely uh, unfiltered in his criticism of it. He did not care who thought what about him. That quality itself is a manifestation. That power comes from Bhairava. That power only comes because it is Bhairava who teaches you how to be fearless. You don't care what people think. You don't care what society thinks. You do that which is right. Bhairava manifests, and the first thing he does is that he cuts down Brahma's ego. Brahma, who thought till that time that he had the four Vedas and you knew everything about everything, there is nothing more to there. And then suddenly, out of Shiva's anger, comes out Bhairava, and he cuts off one head of Brahma, even with the small nail of his finger. So, this is the power of reality. Bhairava is raw reality. He is Digambara, that is why. So coming back to Swami Vivekananda, once he came back from Chicago later on in India, he did face a lot of criticism. There are many books depicting his life afterwards, where the major Hindu religious leaders considered him to be a heretic, to the extent that on his death, almost all Hindu leaders of Bengal at that time boycotted coming to his funeral, though the ordinary people flocked en masse because he was very popular among people, like he is today and like he will be even centuries later for that matter. Uh, it took a lot of time for Belur Math to be able to construct the Samadhi of Swami Vivekananda where he was cremated, because they didn't have funds. It's only years, not years, decades later, as the revolutionaries of the Indian national parties who were fighting against the British colonial rule in India, they started reading Vivekananda and they became so inspired by him that they started quoting him and speaking about him. And then immediately there was an upsurge of devotion towards Vivekananda across the nation. So this man has the power to influence some of the greatest minds and some of the greatest characters and men of terrific strength, rationality, of great ethics, and men of great power who have the ability to make changes in the material plane. So imagine the kind of source of power that Vivekananda used to have, the aura that he used to carry, the energy that he had built. Because you, or any individual, the kind of life that you lead, the activities that you do, ends up creating an energy field and an aura around you that survives even after your death. For 99% of people, once they're dead, and that includes even people who are so called religious, within 3 to 4 generations, nobody is going to remember your name. So that itself is the end of existence. But here is a man, 100 years later, uh, his aura, his attraction, his power, uh, his thoughts are influencing millions and millions of people. I mean, he is undoubtedly the most popular Swami that we have, and there is no sign of it coming down. It will not come down. I mean, during his contemporary days, there were many other spiritual gurus also, both traditional and otherwise, who had their own following, but they are hardly remembered. I mean, leaving aside maybe a 5% of people or 10%, nobody really cares about them. This is this change of who is remembered, who is granted the gift of immortality or not, is entirely in the hands of Mahakal, and nobody can judge that. Mahakal decides who has what power in him, who has what divine Shakti, and accordingly he decides who is going to be remembered for how long, whose words will be impactful even now, and who is going to be forgotten within a few years or maybe at best a decade or so after they leave the physical existence. So, Swami Vivekananda is without a doubt, in my opinion, the most impactful spiritual figure that we have over the last 100 years. And the way things are going, in fact, in this context, speaking of criticism, I have seen various groups at various times try to criticize Vivekananda. It ends up nowhere, though. At the end, they have to, they face, the reaction that they face from the public is so severe that they end up taking a U-turn and co-opting Vivekananda somewhere or the others. I had seen some political parties of the left inclination in Bengal trying to criticize Vivekananda, and then the reaction that they faced made them take a U-turn and then suddenly start claiming that Vivekananda was the first leftist. So like this, everybody does their own U-turns with respect to Vivekananda because his energy is so strong, it captivates people so immensely, and it uplifts the spirit of ordinary people, ordinary Hindus, regardless of their, the non-casteist Hindus, let's put it this way. And there's a huge majority of Hindus that are actually that today. And that is, I mean, this is a very complicated topic. Maybe some other video I will mention, but the writing is very clearly on the wall, as to say it proverbially. Uh, the caste consciousness, the caste mores are going to be broken down. It is already almost non-existent in 60% of uh, major towns and cities. When you go for a job, nobody cares what caste you are. When you are eating in a restaurant, nobody knows what is the caste of the cook, etc. People, super casteist people, end up working outside India in jobs in environments where all the caste rules are rampantly broken. So all this is all a khichdi. Actually, it's an inner state of you know. Uh, in a state of division, in a state of non-reality or delusion for that matter. So the ego hangs on to it, but inside it is already corrupted and gone. Nature sees these things. The reason I'm mentioning this is nature is very brutal. It doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your ego one bit. Nature sees what is the truth in a certain idea. The moment that truth has been replaced by a lot of inner falsehoods, immediately nature decides that now this path is going to change, and nature is going to completely remove that. And we are already seeing, I mean, in another 50, 60 years, we will see whatever traces of whatever kinds of casteism still exists will even reduce further. And this is going to happen organically. I mean, it doesn't matter how much traditionalists can cry about it and cope about it. This writing is, reality is that which exists even after all your opinions, illusions, delusions, everything is ripped apart. That is the state of Bhairava, that is the state of Digambara, that is the reality that nature forces everybody to accept. In fact, in long back when I read the Aghora books of by that of that famous Aghori Vimalananda, it had a very impactful statement that either you live with reality or reality comes to live with you. This is exactly what is happening in the space regarding castes and etc. We are in a transition phase. In that context, and in the overall context of Swami Vivekananda's life, I find him to be an absolutely stellar character. Yes, there may be certain statements of his, or maybe a certain analysis of his, which I personally may or may not agree with, which is entirely different. But that takes nothing away from the fact that his spiritual stature is absolutely stellar. And spirituality, dharma, at the end is practice, less of philosophy. With philosophy and a lot of scriptural reading, you can end up becoming a professor in some university and pretend to be very knowledgeable. That's good. But Hindu society has always ensured that people who actually experience those states, and that will reflect in their behavior, in the aura they carry, are always put at a higher pedestal. This is an organic and a spontaneous knowledge that we have acquired over centuries and centuries, which is why we have great saints who, some of them could not even write their names, much less read scriptures and all that. Whether it's Ramakrishna, whether it's Bhamakapa, with so many others, innumerable saints like that. This knowledge is always there. So just because you know a lot of scriptures doesn't mean that it automatically reflects that you have understood and you have been able to apply. Dharma is that which is lived. There is nothing called theoretical dharma. I mean, I can do whatever I want, and I have read 10 books, and then I write 10 thesis papers and all that. That may be good in the environment, small environment of an academic setting for 10 people, but the ordinary society doesn't accept that as a sign of credibility or as a sign of authority. So with this, I'll conclude the talk on Swami Vivekananda, but it's be absolutely certain of this, that Vivekananda was a completely divine being. In fact, he was, to reiterate again, almost like a manifestation of Bhairava on this plane, and the impact of his energy, impact of his aura, impact of his words are still visible 100 years later, and it is only increasing exponentially. I don't see it falling down or reducing among anybody. On the contrary, he surpasses everybody else by miles and miles in terms of the impact, in terms of the ability to uplift people who are weak or people who are unsure of whether to follow dharma or not. In fact, one of the great historian Hindutva scholars had mentioned that it is the impact of Swami Vivekananda. Remember, at that time, Bengal and especially Calcutta used to be the hub of missionary activities. The advent of Vivekananda ensured that the middle class stopped converting to Christianity at that time, and they started thinking of dharma, Hindu dharma, as something to be proud of. Every desh, every kal, every context requires the advent of spiritual figures who can speak in that language, in that context, in that times. If you speak a language and a tone and a manner and system which is perhaps relevant, which was popular, or which was the mainstay some 1000 years ago, nobody is going to connect to you. I mean, that's your failure. You can say, of course, you can always say that nobody connects and you can be happy with your 10 people. That's fine, but that's not going to have any impact. In any case, that also means that nature has not given you the role or the authority to be able to cause a change in society. That is a very rare thing, and only the greatest of souls, only the specific uh, uh, jivatmas who come with certain portion, the amsa of different deities, who are given that role to make a change. And Vivekananda was certainly that. Jai Ma Kamakhya, Jai Bhairava Baba, Jai Matara.